Okay, so the third statistic that we talk about here is the price level, which we've been hearing a lot about basically since COVID, since that's kind of one of the economic problems that have really kind of emerged in a way that hasn't been since the late 1970s. So, up until COVID, we, in the United States at least, from the early 1980s all the way till 2020, we had an average price level that was increasing by only about 2% a year. And then, although economists somewhat debate what happened in 2020, but that there was a change in 2020 that caused the inflation rate, the rise in the increase in prices to go to a rate that was about 7 or 8%. So let's say nearly triple. And so what we're looking at in this chapter, chapter 8, is the overall increase in prices. And we can see, what we're going to see here is that economists are going to measure it with something known as the CPI. And if I looked at it, and I make this graph be a little bit different here. That you can see in this simple graph that I made where it's talking about how much prices are changing per year, that again, in the late 1970s, we had an inflation rate or a rise in prices of about 13.5% on an annualized basis, crippling to an economy. Then again, after that happens, and we'll talk about how you get that decrease there. But basically, again, since 1983, all the way till COVID, right, you get a pretty stable period of time. In fact, let's change this. Let's do it from 1984, January to 2019. I mean, look at that. In that pretty long span of time, the inflation rate's never going greater than 5%, but it's staying in a pretty narrow range of between, let's say, 1 to 3%. It's not changing that much, to be honest. I mean, look at that. Right on the eve of COVID, 1.8%. That's really small. And then again, we bring that out to at least 2023, and that's where you see everyone getting worked up about it, where it approaches basically 8% in 2022. A quick, dramatic increase in prices. The part of the question would be is why is that happening? So we need to talk about how we're going to calculate changes in prices. You can kind of see here that it's with something known as the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and we're going to use that as our measurement for how prices are changing. Okay, so let's get into the slides. Okay, what have we looked at already? In the previous two chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7, we were looking at both the GDP, using the GDP as a way to measure our overall production levels, and then again using the unemployment rate to talk about overall employment levels. And we talked about some of the key statistics that we would measure, again, across these two areas. That we would use the real GDP to measure production, that we would look at unemployment by looking at the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. And that brings us to prices, where the questions become then, how are we going to measure prices? Why do we care about prices changing? And what's causing them to change? And how do we stop it once we know that a problem exists? Okay, and so to do this, we're going to rely on a statistic that also emerges at around the same time, late 1940s, known as the Consumer Price Index. And the same group that measures unemployment, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, also does the calculation for the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Now we're going to talk about this in the slides that are coming up, but essentially it's a pretty simple task here. It's called Consumer Price Index. So the consumer part of it is what they do is they look at what a typical household consumer would buy in a month. And then they literally go to the stores and they look at what the prices are for the things that people buy. Right? So if they say that the typical consumer buys 8 gallons of milk a month, once a month they'll go to the grocery store and they'll see what does a gallon of milk cost. Now, there's some benefits to doing it that way, but there's also some problems in calculating it that way. All things that we're going to look at here. So let's be clear about the terms that we're talking about here. We're basically talking about sorry, I'm trying to find where there I am. We're talking about the percentage change in prices. It's either positive percentage change if we have inflation, negative, we would call it deflation, and we then have also a term called hyperinflation, where it basically increases quite high. What you're seeing here, this is the classic example that people really like to talk about, and that would be Zimbabwe, which experienced hyperinflation, which created a situation where you can go on eBay and you can buy a $50 trillion bill from when they had inflation. It's a really big bill. The hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, we'll talk about it a little bit more here later, but this would be a situation where the economy was quite unstable. $100 trillion bill for $70. Yeah. Let me go back here just for a little bit more. What we see in this kind of situation is that generally economists are going to say that a little bit of inflation is a good thing. There's complicated reasons why that's the case, but actually as long as the inflation is predictable, inflation isn't even an issue. Because you can design everything else, the contracts and everything else, around a steady, predictable increase in prices, right? You could say that the wages are going to increase by a certain percentage, that my long-term contracts are going to increase by a certain percentage. Banks are going to be willing to make loans for like a mortgage, which is a 30-year commitment based on what they think, prices are going to be 30 years out. All those things can be done if the inflation is predictable and if it's going up at a small, steady rate. Where problems start to emerge is when the prices fall, when we have deflation. Let's go back to that graph that I created. Look at this. We have a very small moment here in 2009 in the depths of the economic crisis where prices actually fell. Now, that is really bad when that happens. Why it's so bad is because while we have pretty strong mechanisms that allow prices to go up by certain amounts every year, we don't have very strong institutional mechanisms that allow prices to fall. Because, I remember working, I worked at the University of Wisconsin at the time, and we all had to take a furlough, meaning that there was a deduction in our wage for a certain amount of time. I mean, that's quite demoralizing. Who wants to accept a lower wage? Yet, that's exactly what would rationally need to happen if we had deflation, right? Is that the employer should be paying you less. It's just what employee wants to receive less and be told, well, CPI says that that prices fell 0.3%. And be like, dude, yeah, I see how you're eager to now follow CPI when prices are falling, but you don't raise my wage when prices are going up, right? I mean, that was my kind of general reaction as an economist. And certainly my wage did not go up by 8% when in 2022. So screw you. The only other time we get only very rare instances otherwise where prices are falling. You'd have to go all the way back to shortly after World War II. And then before that, you'd have to go all the way back to the Great Depression. We don't have very many instances of deflation. And we certainly see the destabilizing nature of prices going up. Let's just change this graph again. Yeah, we can kind of see that it's a little bit more stark on a semi-annual basis. We can see that prices would have went down by 3%. And then let's just change it to quarterly. Again, do we actually really think that in 2008 prices went down 9%? And then finally on a monthly basis, do we actually think that it was close to 10% in the very worst part of the recession? Not likely. You get these other rare instances where weird things are going on, where the prices are falling for a short period of time, but it's pretty rare to have it in a sustained way where prices are falling. And again, you can see, we don't have to rely on this old data. You can go right to Fred and see the actual data as it exists. In general, again, the United States' economy is considered strong by other economists because of the consistency, roughly speaking, where the inflation is largely contained within 2 to 4%. Again, the concern would be today is that we are just far off of that. Because even if we go back to this chart here, and I just look at the past 5 years, what we would see is that inflation is starting to increase again after we thought we had it under control. And that's all been happening over the past 6 months. That would be pretty bad. And we don't really know where things are going here. Okay, so CPI. Again, this is looking at what a typical consumer would be buying over a span of time, calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which does it through the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is calculated as a fixed basket of goods. And what it means here again for us is that the quantities stay the same. So if we were again to write out like milk and bread and cereal and gasoline, we would have a fixed quantity per month, 10, 12, 12, and let's say 100 gallons of gas, right? Whatever it is. But what we allow to happen is that we allow the price to change in all the various years, such that the total basket which is simply Q times P1, Q times P2, and then Q times P3. We allow that total basket to change in price, which would be then how we can calculate that percentage change in the basket to look at how overall prices are changing. The bulk of the CPI number the bulk of that basket is determined by housing costs. That's 41.6%. So in essence, the rapid inflation that we saw in 2022 was that kind of like housing market craze that we all kind of saw around us, right? Where you watch TV and someone's buying a house for, an interest rate below 3% and they're buying a really big house, or that people were seeing their rents go up quite a bit. I mean, that's almost half of what is driving the CPI. And then you've got transportation, which is pretty important. And then you've got a bit more volatile things like food, and we've also got energy costs as part of this. That's why if we go back to here, you can see that we calculate some things a little bit different so that we can take out things that are more volatile. And what we can see here is that if we should probably get rid of this. We can see this general relationship between the two, which might be pretty similar, but again, we shouldn't see that big of differences between the two once we take out the more volatile components. And so from there, what we see is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, again, it's going to create this this general idea of how prices should change. And they look at 38 different geographic locations. And they look at 8,000 different goods and services, and it basically becomes someone's job to go to different stores and write down what the prices are of these 8,000 different goods in these various cities. And it is cities. So we're talking about urban consumers here. So if you live in a rural area, that's not going to be covered by what's happening here in the CPI. And that what we do is we calculate an index, a price index. Again, this is called CPI, right? So the I in CPI, the I in CPI is the index number. So how do we create that index? The index is coming from here, which is the basket price in the current year over the basket price in the base year. And you would have to determine what this base year is. It's all dependent on your year of reference. In the base year, the price index is 100. Right? And then for other years, you would calculate what that is. So if I said that the basket, right, which we went through that calculation right here, sorry, back here. Right, remember back to here, right? We can find the price of the basket in the various years. If I say that my base year is year 1, which I could kind of define that it is, and I were to say that this basket costs $1,000 this year, $1,200 this year, and $1,500 this year, then what I could say is that the CPI in year 1 would be equal to 1,000 over 1,000 times 100, right? Which would just be the 100, as I said. But that in year 2, it would be equal to the price of the basket in that year, which is 1,200, over the price of the basket in the base year, which I had said was year 1, times 100, it's going to be 120. Now, what we would do is then say, what's the percentage change in the CPI? So that would be my new number, 120, minus my old number, over my old number, times 100, which would give me a 20% change. That's how, when we talk about inflation, those are the steps that we follow to calculate it. Okay. So, and that's what we see here. This is just our percentage change calculation. That's just how we're calculating percentage change. New minus old over old times 100 to be able to talk about this as a percentage change. And so here we see some of the math a little bit more here, where I could talk about popcorn quantities not changing. So this is a fixed basket, but the price changing from 6 to 8, from 5 staying at 5, from 12 to 13. But once you do the math with how many are bought times the price, you add those up to get your total basket price, and then calculate your index number. And then the final step to this would be calculating the percentage change in those index numbers. And that's what we would see right here. But not surprisingly, what we do see when we look at the general data is that inflation exists in the United States. And that, yes, we do have periods of time when prices have increased dramatically. But this would also be, again, we can see this pronounced difference after the 1980s. As high as that inflation was, it really pushed the Federal Reserve and economists in general to care a lot about what the inflation rates were. And we got to enjoy this incredibly long, nearly 40-year time period of really low, stable inflation. This would also explain, though, why your grandmother or your grandfather says, when I was a young kid, something used to cost so little. Well, yeah, they're talking about a period of time where the CPI was a much lower level than what it is today. The number itself, the index number itself, doesn't really matter that it's 280, because this was set as if the index number, the base year, was about 1984. If I'd made my index number 2000, then all these numbers are going to be different. And we can do that really quickly. Here, let me get rid of this. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go here. And so right there, do you see that? Index, 1982 to 1984. So they're picking that as their base year, 82 to 84. But I think, yeah, it lets me change this. I can pick a different time period. So I'm going to pick the 2009 recession, the end of it. So look at that. Now it's no longer 280, right? Here was 148. And I can change it based on, okay, I want to go back to the 1980 recession, which was really bad, right? That's a much different number. And again, I can go to, oh, that recession, that was a pretty bad one. Again, the index number is going to be very different. We don't care what the index number specifically is. What we care about is calculating the percentage change in the index numbers. And that part will not change. You'll still get the same percentage change number, regardless of what your index numbers are. And what we know is that, again, there are things that are changing in price that tend to rise in price over time. Travel, education, healthcare, all things that get much more expensive over time. And we see it the other way as well. That other way that we see it is that there are some things, some specific goods that fall in price over time. And the way that we see that would be with things like electronics. Oh God, I still remember buying my first DVD player in the early 2000s. It was something like $400, whereas I'm sure I could go onto Amazon and probably get one, I'm going to guess, for less than 30. Not too bad. 39 bucks. Oh, here we go. Here's my less than $30 DVD player right here. Right? Those are pretty significant decreases in price that we typically see with technology items. Okay. Yes, what we see here is that these things are becoming cheaper in price, especially electronics, just because technology is reducing the production costs for those things. Again, what we can do is we can use these CPI values to then backwards calculate, what something costs way back in the past. We can calculate what the equivalent of that amount of money would have been in the future. So if I, again, in this example here, if I told you that in 1924 that a house used to cost less than $2,000, well, what we would want to know is what does that cost in today's dollars? So what we would need to know is we would need to know what the price levels were. So we'd have to go to a chart, a table, that would tell us what the number was in 1924. Not sure why they don't do it for us here, but let's... how far does it let us go back? Oh, that's cool. Look at that. We can find it here pretty easy. Okay. Price level in 1924 was 17.1. Today, it is 314.4. Again, the index numbers themselves do not matter, but we're going to use that here. Okay, so let's put in the numbers that we got. So this would be the 1969 times the price level of today, which is 314.4, divided by 17.1. Okay, let me put that into my calculator here. $36,201. Still pretty cheap, if you ask me, for a house. I'm not sure you could still buy that, but what you would be saying is that the price today for that house, that the equivalent today would be $36,201. So then, how do we compare that to a house today that might cost $100,000 or $200,000? Well, different things are going on in the housing and construction industry that might have caused significant inflation beyond the overall price level change. But what we also see is that as prices are going up, that they're going up, when the prices go up, we don't actually know what the, is it the case that prices this past year, well, actually, let's look here. Let's go back to our Fred data. So look at this at a glance. Okay, so I can see here at a glance that real GDP went up 2.3%. I can see that the unemployment rate is 4%, right? This is, again, my way of doing a diagnosis of the economy. 4% unemployment rate, 2.3% increase in real GDP, so this would be production, unemployment. And now I've got prices going up 3%. Okay, so what is it really that bad or good that it's 3%? Well, what we would suggest to say is that the CPI number tends to overstate, be a little bit higher than the actual inflation rate is. And that the three reasons for that is that there's a substitution bias, that there's changes in the quality of the good, and that there's new products and locations. So let's, I know, I have a good example here. My father tells the story of buying his first new car in 1974. It was a Chevy Nova 49.3. Okay. And we got 314.4, which would mean for us here. And he tells me that he paid in 1974 that he paid $4,000 for a new car. Okay, so that would be $4,000, the price of the car, times 314.1 over 17.1. That would make it a 73,471, $473 car. Ooh, for a Chevy Nova? Wow, it's pretty expensive. We'd have to talk about, is that the case? Is that our way of understanding the change that occurred there? The issue would be is that $4,000 car in 1974 would be the equivalent of a $73,000 car today. But one would argue that the car today is so much safer and more reliable that it even, it's just a better looking car, safer, more efficient than it was in 1974. And the CPI isn't going to necessarily take that into account. So changes in quality are not reflected in the CPI. And then the other issue would be substitution bias. Let's go back to this right here. I actually don't go to the movies as much as I used to. And the reason why is I'm not all super excited about Marvel and DC and superheroes and stuff. So I'm not going to the movies that much. But in this kind of thing here, we're assuming that every month the consumer goes to 2 movies a month. But I've actually substituted away from it and buy other things instead. That can't happen in our construction of CPI. So there is a bias there. And then the third one is this new products and locations. It takes time for the CPI to reflect well, what have I done instead, right? I subscribe to more streaming services and whatnot. And so that's not necessarily going to be reflected in the CPI until that new product can be taken into account. And it can take quite a bit of time to do that. So since 1989, dealing with these particular issues, since 1999, there has been an attempt by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to try to take into account the fact that some substitution does occur. It's some advanced econometric techniques we don't need to get too worked up about. Since 1999 as well, there has been an attempt to take into account the fact that that the quality of goods is increasing. And so you try to take that into account, where now what the people who check the prices have to take into account, like, additional features that the product has, maybe additional longevity of the product, and try to take that into account for the good. Actually, one of the interesting things about this too, because I've read a Wall Street Journal article about this, is that what they really strive to do is actually still find the original product, so that they're not finding new and improved product that might have a slightly higher price. They will keep looking and looking, for typewriter rolls, even though people don't buy typewriters anymore. This one doesn't happen that often. For instance, it's only recently that the Bureau of Labor Statistics insisted that it had to be physical stores and started looking at prices online. They've tried to update, like, people, the new things that people buy, trying to incorporate that into the CPI. But again, this one's a little bit harder. This bias, in my opinion, still is pretty strong out there. And so then what economists do is they would have an option to look at either the traditional CPI, which is the thing we kind of focused on here, or they could look at what's called the chained CPI, which kind of links, like a chain, links the previous CPI to the current CPI. We can create this kind of chart ourselves. This is the kind of exciting thing about this time in the course, is we don't have to rely on old data. Okay, so let's do this. Looks like I'll get it best with this here. I need to remove the sign. Okay, actually, it's not that easy to create this. Sorry. I was getting excited about this, but it's actually not that easy to create. It's a little bit more difficult to do this. The current reports aren't generally linking back to CPI in this kind of way. We could go back here. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I can go to CPI. I don't want all that data, sorry. So you can get the index here. Right, and I can kind of see these changes for all these various categories. I can see how things are changing. So for instance, I can see energy prices are going down, yet they're dramatically going up, right? In recent months, they've been dramatically going up from where they were about 9 months ago, or 6 months ago, sorry. So why do we care? Like, what is it about inflation that makes it so bad? Well, we've got all these issues here. What's that person doing? If you look at that pretty closely, that person looks to be making a basket out of money because the money is not worth anything. You got these classic historical examples here where hyperinflation in Germany before World War II, where people were burning it for wood. Now, these kids are getting to play with it and building like a little structure. There's always the classic, this person's using it to cook. There's always the one too where someone is making wallpaper. Where's the wallpaper one? These are kind of classic pictures. There's one where a person is, whatever, it doesn't matter. Basically, this money has become, oh, here it is. The money has become worthless, and they're just like, dude, I'm not going to buy fancy wallpaper. I'm just going to use my money to do this. That's part of the problem of what happens when inflation gets so high, is that the value of the currency itself goes away. Right? Someone somewhere in some office right now is thinking, what happens if the US dollar has a 20% inflation rate? I mean, what do we see people doing? Right? Kids these days are then going out and buying cryptocurrencies, thinking that that's going to be a better way to control inflation and insulate themselves from it. Or they're buying gold, or they're buying silver, right? Or they want to, buy another country's currency. There's other cost of inflation though as well. And we'll just look at these all in the next few slides here. So let's just go first to shoe leather costs. As inflation goes up, one of the problems here is that it just becomes more costly to hold money because you have to spend all of this time. I guess this comes from a time when people would have leather on the bottom of their shoes and get them resold and whatnot. But you'd have to waste a lot of resources always trying to find cheaper prices and whatnot. And so that cost is something that not everyone's going to want to bear. So they might not want to hold US dollars anymore if it costs them a lot of time and energy to use those dollars. This happens all the time. So I'm in a union, and the union back in 2021 or 2022 negotiated a 5% increase in the wage. And everyone, all of my colleagues got super excited about their wage going up. But what was Scheiding thinking? Right? Scheiding could go here. This is about like 2021, 2022. Could be looking at this and saying, dude, prices went up 8% and you're giving me 5%? I just lost money, right? I'm not getting an increase. The employer saying, we love you so much, we're giving you 5% more. Yet if the prices went up by 8%, I actually lost 3% of my purchasing power. People thought that they were richer, when in fact they were not. And so that's why it's important not to worry so much about your nominal wage, but really worry about what your real wage is, where the real wage takes into account how much the price levels are changing. And so that's what we see right here, right? Nominal wages go up by 3, prices go up by 5. You might think that you're wealthier, but your purchasing power has actually decreased by 2%. 5 minus 3. Then we get this issue where There are menu costs. It's called menu costs because we could think about it in terms of a menu at a a menu at a restaurant. But the idea here is that it costs money to change prices. And so if prices keep going up, I would have to go out to the store shelves and adjust all the prices to reflect that. Not necessarily something I would want to do. This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest consequences of inflation, is that it makes long-term contracts really difficult to get. It makes borrowing money riskier, or lending money riskier. I bought my house in 2020, largely before COVID and all this excitement about houses occurred. And if you were to ask me, I would say the bank lost out on that deal because they signed we all signed the contract at a time just at the very end of when inflation was a reasonable, manageable, small amount. And since then, it's been nothing but high. Certainly higher than what my interest rate is. So what would that mean in terms of lending? The bank is getting paid back with money that's less valuable than what they lent me back in 2020. It's easier for me to pay back my mortgage because the money is worth less. So the bank is losing out. It's a 30-year contract, right? It's a 30-year mortgage, so I get to keep it for 30 years, this sweetheart deal that I've got, unless I'm willing to move, right, and cancel it. But then what do you think the bank is going to think about now the next time they make a 30-year contract? They're not going to want to make it so willingly, right, if they can't reasonably predict how prices are going to change. Going back all the way to 1980, right, when we look at that one classic chart, prices were pretty predictable for the past 40 years. So when they got that deal in 2020, the bank probably just thought, it'll just keep going as it has for the past 40 years. But then obviously, it was not that way. The United States is somewhat unique. We are about one of the few countries in the world that offer 30-year mortgages. Most other countries do not offer contracts that long. In part, because of the fact that we have pretty reasonable, controllable inflation, that you can get a 30-year mortgage, whereas in other countries you cannot. Another problem with inflation is that it causes random wealth redistribution. And it's the random part that's the problematic part of this. Again, I borrowed money in 2020 based on what an expected inflation rate was. And it turns out that inflation was unexpectedly higher. So in this case, in my scenario, because of that unexpected inflation, it was easier. I have benefited. It's been easier for me to pay off the loan, right? And the bank has been hurt. So wealth in this case has been redistributed from the bank to me. Yay me, right? But the bank's money came from some little old woman, right, who saved her money in a bank account, who, had her money in a CD and agreed to less than 1% inflation, or 1% interest rate because of the expected inflation rate. And then when the inflation rate went up dramatically, she unexpectedly lost out on that deal. So it was actually a transfer of wealth from the little old woman to myself. Again, it's the randomness, it's the unexpected nature of this that makes economists a little bit grumpy, and why controlling inflation is so important. And we can see this here. Okay, so I don't usually stick with these practice what you knows here, but if Juan in 2022 took out a fixed interest rate, and the inflation rate between 2024 and 2028 was unexpectedly high, then the bank, again, in this case, would be hurt. One would have a fixed interest rate that reflected the lower inflation rate in 2022 because it was unexpectedly higher. The money is more plentiful for Juan to be able to pay that mortgage out. The other problem that can occur with inflation is that producers can get confused about what's all happening in the economy. The reason why the confusion can occur is that the firm is going to know the price of the thing it's selling. It's going to know that thing very, very well, but it's going to have less certainty about how the prices of other things are changing, like the resources they buy, like wages, etc. So when the company realizes that they can get, let's say, 2% or let's say 5% more for the product they're selling, they might mistakenly think that the price went up because everyone wants their thing. And they might then expand out their output because they think, oh, this thing is in high demand. But instead, if the price went up not because more people were buying the thing, but because prices were going up, then there should have been no change in output. And so this did happen back in 2022. I mean, this was essentially the debate. Companies like, just various companies saying, oh, everyone wants to buy my product post-COVID. When instead, it was just that prices were going up. They expanded their output capabilities, but they shouldn't have done that. Another problem here with inflation would come down to distortions in taxes. This is because taxes are determined using tax tables, but those numbers might not change as often because usually they have to be approved by Congress. And we can even look at something as simple as, if I sold a house for more than what I purchased it for, and I have to pay a tax based on the capital gains, it might not be because the product itself has become more valuable, but it might be just because other prices have increased. And so I'd want to have a way, to be fair, I'd want to have a way where I didn't pay taxes on inflation, which is essentially what you'd be doing here. In this case, the author of the textbook constructed this where something that cost $80,000 in 1980 would, based on inflation, cost $230,000 in 2012. So this would all be pure inflation. Yet, because there was a capital gain, right, from 80 to 230, that $150,000 in capital gains, if you had to pay tax on that, you'd be basically paying a tax on inflation itself. And so that's our kind of summary here. Now, again, why is it that we're seeing inflation? Why is it that prices went up so much in 2022? I hate to be the person that says this, but back in 2020, when COVID happened, I can see the data of what's changing, right? I go on Fred every day, so I can see the data of what's changing. And for me, right, I can do it. And for me, we haven't talked about this data yet, but look at what happens here. This is called the money supply here. In the money supply, you can see that the rate of increase in the money supply dramatically changed after COVID, right? In fact, let's just look at it in the past 5 years. I mean, look at that. That's a pretty big change. Should just do 10 years, right? We can see that there's been a fundamental shift and that the shift happened pretty early. I bought my house in September of 2020. I was already looking at this data though. And I could see an amount of money printed, which had gone from $15 trillion to, let's say, 18. So what is that increase from, right, from 15 to 18? That's a 20% increase in the amount of money, right? And then you get to the peak of inflation in 2022, and it's gone up to 21. That's a 51%, 50 to 55% change in the amount of money printed between 2020 and 2022. That there's 50% more money out there. I might not be that smart of a person, but for me, this is how I personally believe. I'm a bit of a monetarist, admittedly. My belief is that the inflation in part is being caused by this increase in the money supply. This would be kind of a classic Friedman argument that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. You see this here in an equation of MV equals PQ, or MVPY, Y and Q being the same thing here. But essentially what we would say here is that if we look at velocity, if we look at the number of times that the money changes hands every year, and then the amount of money produced, the amount of money printed, this is called M2. And the Q being relatively constant, because if you remember all the way back to chapter 2, we have that production possibilities frontier, which kind of limits what our overall real GDP can be. So that would mean that in an equation that looks like this, I've got a real GDP level, which is relatively constant. I have a velocity, which is going to be relatively constant, which would then mean that changes in the M lead to changes in the P. This is the equation of exchange, quantity theory of money. And we could see that changes in the money supply lead to changes in the price level. That's what I used. Go on, Fred. It can, in some sense, predict what future inflation is going to be by just looking at this simple equation. It's pretty predictable. It's quite predictable. Again, if we make the assumption that the velocity of money is relatively constant, and we could look, now this isn't entirely a reasonable assumption because we can actually look here. It does change. It did change a bit more than typical. But even here, it's not that big of a change from 1.3 to 1.1. It's not that big of a change. And in fact, yes, if I look at an annualized basis, it did change quite a bit. But for most of modern economic history, the velocity has not changed that much. So it relatively means that I can rely on this equation pretty well to capture the percentage change in the money supply being linked to changes in the price level. And that we generally see that this is true, right? That if we thought that that quantity equation was true, then we should see things at about a 45-degree line. Now we can see that most of these instances here, 149 of the countries, are all within that general region. So why are we denying this to ourselves? I don't know why we're getting into a debate about the inflation of 2022 was caused by supply chain problems and, return to work, return to office, and government regulations, and all these other excuses. It's a lot simpler than that. The money supply changed. It's that simple. At least for me, it's that simple. So then the question then becomes, why is the government increasing the money supply? what we will see is that, at least with COVID, the largest part of the reason was number two. We'll see here in the closing chapters of this course that the Federal Reserve increased the money supply to make it really cheap to borrow money so that people would stimulate the economy, right, by borrowing lots of money. But again, it's a trade-off. You're choosing to grow the economy now or stimulate the economy now with the expectation that you're going to get the inflation later. So what was the net consequence? Is that the recession during COVID was really short, about 3 months. But the consequence of this was that the consequence of that was rapidly or increased inflation because of that stimulation. The other thing that you could do here for number one, you don't often see this happening, is that the government could pay off its debt by increasing the money supply. You typically see that in countries that are experiencing hyperinflation. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, pre-World War II Germany. That's a bad way. That's a bad reason to be inflating the money supply. Okay. So then, wrapping up our discussion here, what we then generally see here is that, again, for this calculation of CPI, it's giving us an overall way to calculate how prices are changing. But that, again, you really want to focus most, economists really want to focus most on controlling the price level, because typically the case, lots of economic problems happen when you don't control inflation. And so of these three issues that we've now been talking about the past few chapters, of production, employment, and prices, economists focus most on prices of the other two economic problems. Okay.